Well, this is a famous speech, perhaps one of the most famous speeches of the 20th century. It's Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech given on March the 5th, 1946, at Westminster College in Missouri, USA. And why is it so important? Well, it's important because it marked a significant and quite dramatic turn in the relationship between the West and the Soviet Union. Because up until this point, despite the fact that there were certainly tensions and disagreements, the leaders of the West, particularly the US and the UK, had been keen to stress that they wanted to work with the Soviet Union and that they didn't want conflict. They wanted a positive relationship. But by March 1946, that was very much out the window. And Churchill's speech marked a decisive break and the beginning of a new era in which conflict between the West and the Soviet Union was seen as inevitable. So let us have a look at some of the key quotes from the speech and try and understand why it's so significant. So it's March 1946, and Churchill is speaking at Westminster College in Missouri. And he begins his speech by talking about how it is a great honor for him to be there, and how he'd always felt a special connection with America because of its historic ties to Britain. But then he gets down to business, and he makes this famous declaration. He says an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Now, what exactly does he mean by that? Well, when you imagine an iron curtain, it's like a thick, penetrable barrier that prevents people from seeing what's going on the other side. And that's exactly what Churchill is arguing has happened in Central and Eastern Europe. These regions were effectively cut off from the rest of Europe. There was no longer any communication or connection between them. And what had happened, in Churchill's view, was that the Soviet Union set up a series of puppet regimes in these countries, and they now formed a sort of buffer zone between Russia and the rest of Europe. Now, it's worth saying that not everyone agreed with this assessment. Now, some people did argue that these countries did have a degree of autonomy. They weren't just simply puppets. But nonetheless, this was the beginning of what we would call the Iron Curtain. In fact, Churchill actually went further than that. He said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Mediterranean, an iron curtain has been drawn." So he actually encompasses all of Eastern Europe in this sweeping indictment of Soviet policy. But why is this so significant? Well, it's significant, first of all, because it was a very dramatic way of describing what was going on. Up until this point, as I said, Western leaders had tried to be very conciliatory towards the Soviet Union. But here, Churchill is basically saying, look, there's this great divide between the Soviet Union and the rest of Europe. It's only a question of time before conflict comes. And secondly, it's significant because it is a speech that should have been fairly short but actually became incredibly long. It was originally meant to last around 20 minutes, but it ended up lasting for an hour and 40 minutes. And this was partly because Churchill had to keep taking sips of water, which may sound ridiculous. But it was basically code for the fact that he was drinking large amounts of alcohol. And this contributed to the fact that he actually forgot where he was. At one point, he thought that he was in Berlin. So it was a strange speech in that sense. But it was also an incredibly important speech, because it actually marked the symbolic start of the Cold War. And it's interesting who was in attendance when he gave this speech, because no one was more surprised by Churchill's speech than US President Harry Truman, who was in attendance because he'd had no idea that Churchill was going to make this speech. And in a sense, it was something of a masterstroke by Churchill, because it showed that right at the start of this new relationship between the West and the Soviet Union, he had the backing of the US President. So how was the speech received? Well, it was received with great acclaim in the West. People loved it. They thought he was a brilliant orator. But unsurprisingly, it was condemned in the USSR. They denounced the speech, accused him of being a warmonger, and basically trying to provoke conflict between the two superpowers. And the other thing about the speech that was quite significant was it introduced the idea of Soviet sphere of influence. What he argued was that Russia would never accept that Eastern Europe was independent and free. Instead, it would always be part of the Russian sphere of influence. And this was another idea that really took root and was accepted in the West, and was basically used to justify the containment policy that the US would pursue throughout the Cold War. So in summary, a hugely significant speech that marked the definitive break between the West and the Soviet Union, and that contributed to the fact that the next 4 decades of European history would be defined by the struggle between these two superpowers.